we're ready to begin. Today's Torah portion is Miketz, which, if you're in your Blue Ox Scroll Chumash, it can be found on page 222. If not, it's chapter 41 of the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis. Just want to check that everybody could hear. Okay, good. So, a fun fact about this week's Torah portion, or actually I'm going to give you two fun facts about this week's Torah portion. The first one is that Miketz always intersects with the holiday of Hanukkah. So it's either the first half of Hanukkah or the second half of Hanukkah, but there's never a Hanukkah that we're not reading Miketz during the holiday. And this week, of course, is Parshat Miketz. So there's a concept that every time a Torah portion intersects on a particular holiday, even though the Torah portion is not aligned with the calendar of the year, right? So we're going to read the Exodus of Egypt in a couple of weeks from now. It's not Passover time. Now, in addition to reading about the Exodus from Egypt in the annual cycle of the reading, we'll read select sections during the holiday of Passover. But the holidays are not on the same schedule as the weekly Torah portions. But the fact that a particular parsha falls out on a particular holiday, whether it's Hanukkah, whether it's Purim, or whether it's Pesach, means there's also a connection between that week's Torah portion and that particular holiday. So the question is, what's the connection between the holiday of Passover? What's the connection between the holiday of Hanukkah and this week's Torah portion? And there couldn't be a more obvious answer, because it's a very obvious connection. What's the connection? So let's look at the opening story of this week's Torah portion. If you remember last week's Torah portion, Joseph was in prison, falsely accused of seducing his master's wife. He tore away from her grip, was thrown into jail. There in jail, where he spent 12 years in jail, he sees the butler and the baker, and one day they look quite distraught, they look upset. And he says, "What's bothering you? You don't look good today. Madua penechem zoafim. Why do you have long, sad faces?" And they tell him, "We had very disturbing dreams and we don't know what to make of it." He says, "Tell me your dreams. Maybe God could help me interpret it." And they each tell their dream. We won't get into it because it was last week's Torah portion. But Joseph says to the butler, "I have good news for you. The dream means that in 3 days' time, Pharaoh's going to take you out of the prison and repost you in your old position of being the butler to the Pharaoh. He's having a birthday party. He's going to need more staff, more waiters. You're going to be the cupbearer to Pharaoh once again. You're going to be reinstated." And of course, the butler is thrilled to hear the good news. And so the butler says, "Well, I also had a dream." And he proceeds to tell his dream. Unfortunately, Joseph says, "Your dream is not so good. Your dream means that in 3 days, Pharaoh's going to hang you," which Pharaoh did do. Now, when the butler was being taken out to be reinstated to the post, imagine you're in jail with somebody, God forbid, and the person is pardoned by the president of the United States. But not only pardoned, he's going to be in the cabinet of the White House. He's going to be part of the president's inner cabinet, and he's going to be in the Oval Office every day. So you say, "Listen, do me a favor, tell the president to pardon me too, because you're going to be seeing the president all the time." Well, basically, the butler was going to be serving Pharaoh his drinks. He says, "Do me a favor, tell Pharaoh I'm an innocent Jew imprisoned here. I didn't do anything wrong. I've been here already 10 years at that time. Please tell him about my plight and have him set me free." Now, of course, we know that a Jew is supposed to always try to do whatever he can or she can within the natural means to help themselves. And Joseph was trying to help himself get out of jail. The butler leaves the jail, and for 2 years, Joseph doesn't hear a word. Why? Because the butler forgot about him. It was nice when he had him to help him, but many times, unfortunately, people, you help them and you say, "Listen, can you help me out?" And what happens? They forget all about you. And that's what happens. They forget. The butler forgets about Joseph. But 2 years later, what happens 2 years later? 2 years later, Pharaoh has dreams that are bothering him, and he can't make any sense of it. And he asks all his interpreters, explain to me the meaning of my dream, and nobody could give him a good explanation. And that's where the butler steps forward and says, do I have the guy for you? I know the perfect person. He knows how to interpret dreams. He interpreted mine and the baker's, and he was absolutely right. So he's the man. Now notice, when does the butler step forward? When he could, be of help to Pharaoh and make himself look good and, win some points with Pharaoh that he found the right interpreter. But be that as it may, 2 years after the butler goes free, which means now Joseph has been in prison for 12 years, they run to the prison, they summon Joseph. He's a prisoner. They have to get him nice clothing, take off his prison uniform, put him on nice clothing, give him a haircut. And sure enough, he's presented to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh proceeds to tell him about his dreams. Now, what were the dreams that Pharaoh had? Pharaoh had 2 dreams. The first dream was about cows, and the second one was about sheaves of grain. And what does he tell Joseph? He said, I had 2 dreams. The first dream, which we know the dreams because we read about the dreams in real time when Pharaoh had it. He said, I was standing at the Nile, and suddenly out of the Nile come 7 fat, robust, beautiful, healthy-looking cows. But then 7 thin, emaciated, ugly cows came out of the river. And what happened in my dream? Now, dreams don't have to make sense. But what happens in his dream is the skinny cows, the gaunt, emaciated, ugly-looking cows, swallowed up the big, fat, healthy, robust-looking cows. Now, what happened when Pharaoh had the dream? He woke up, and what did he do? He went back to sleep. Now he had a second dream. In the second dream, he sees 7 ears of grain. Once again, very robust, very healthy looking, big stalks. And then there are 7 thin ears of grain that look very scorched. And they grow after the fat, robust stalks of grain. And then the thin, emaciated, skinny, scorched, thin sheaves of grain, ears, swallow up the healthy and full ones. Pharaoh says, I had this dream twice, first with cows, then with grain. What in the world is going on? So Yosef, and this is quite remarkable, if you weren't impressed with Yosef yet, the story of Joseph, I love this story because every time you're impressed with him, he does something else that makes you more impressed with him, right? So first he's thrown into the pit. He becomes a slave. He becomes the most successful slave in his master's house. Wow. Then the wife tries to seduce him. He remains moral. He runs out away from her. Wow. Then he's in prison. He's worried about other prisoners' welfare, interpreting their dreams. He's successful in the prison. They appoint him in charge of it. Wow. Now he comes out and watch what he does now. Now he's going to do more. He's going to forgive his brothers later. That's going to be really wow. But look what happens now. And I think this is a wow moment. Try to put yourself in Joseph's shoes. You've been in prison, God forbid, 12 years. This is your ticket to freedom, right? The Pharaoh needs you. He heard you know how to interpret dreams. He calls you to interpret the dream. And you have a knack, a skill, a talent, an ability, a gift from God that you could interpret dreams. I know what I would say. Sure, I could interpret your dream. Let me help you out here, right? Because I need to get out of prison. But Yosef, the literal words that come out of mouths of Yosef is biladai. Pharaoh, I can't do anything. It's not me. Got the wrong guy. You know why? Elokim yanet shlom paro. God is going to answer your dream. I'm just a messenger. I'm just a conduit. I'm just a vessel. But the interpretation is not for me. I don't interpret dreams. That's a God ability. God is going to have to give me the interpretation. In other words, he downplays his significance, his importance, his role, showing really extreme humility, but also in a moment that he could have utilized for his own promotion, he said, I'm just a conduit for God's interpretation. And we all know the famous dream interpretation that Joseph gives to Pharaoh, which we can talk about at length later on, that there's going to be 7 fat years and 7 skinny years, 7 years of plenty, abundance, and 7 years of famine. And a lot of economists talk about cycles even today. The markets do well, economy booms, and then unfortunately there's a downturn. And then, these are the cycles. But this is what Joseph tells them. But before we get into the dreams, I just want to point out the original question. What's the connection between Hanukkah? So we all know that Hanukkah has 2 miracles. The miracle of the menorah, the candle burnt 8 days, but the miracle of the victory. A small band of Maccabees stood up against the mighty Greek armies and defeated them. And we say in the Al Hanisim prayer that we say morning and evening every single day, we say, God, Masarta Giborim Biyad Chalashim, you delivered the mighty into the hands of the weak, and the many into the hands of the few. That even though the Greek armies were more powerful and larger than the Maccabees, the Maccabees were a small band of fighters, outnumbered and outgunned. They still beat them. Now you understand the connection between the 2 stories. What happens in the dream? The thin, skinny cows and ears of grain devoured the large, healthy, big, strong, robust. And what happened in the miracle of Hanukkah? The thin army of the Maccabees, the small, weak army of the Maccabees, defeated the strong and mighty army. So both of them have the same message. But what is the deeper message? The deeper message is that according to the laws of nature, we all know survival of the fittest, right? The fittest, the strongest, the most powerful devours the weak and the small. That's the natural law of the world. But that's if you take God out of the equation. If there's no God, then that's the natural order of the world. But if God's in the equation, then God can cause the mighty to be defeated by the small and the weak. And if God is in charge of the world, there could be 7 years of plenty, and then the same soil, the same Nile that irrigates the same soil could withhold its food for 7 years. Naturally, there may not be a way to explain it, but if God runs the world, anything's possible because he decides, not nature. Nature is only an instrument, a tool in God's hands. So that's the connection between Hanukkah and the story of Miketz, and more importantly, the message of Hanukkah, which is that God is not just the creator of the world, but the ruler and the overseer and the manager of all the affairs of the world. And that's something only Joseph understood. You see, one of the questions about the dream of Pharaoh is, it says that Pharaoh asked all his interpreters to interpret the dream. And nobody came up with this interpretation. The rabbis actually give a whole bunch of other interpretations they came up with. But wouldn't this be a pretty, it's not such a far-fetched interpretation. Grain and meat is all about food. 7 and 7, so you got 2 cycles of 7. Then the plentiful ones, the fat ones, the robust ones are devoured by the sky. I mean, what was such a genius of Pharaoh, of Joseph, and Pharaoh was so impressed when he heard this interpretation. He says, Joseph, there's no one like you in all of Egypt. Not only are you going to be a free man, I'm going to make you viceroy of Egypt. So what Joseph did that nobody else did was, you see, it says that when Joseph was in prison, he never hid his Jewish identity. He told the butler, tell Pharaoh that I'm a Jewish slave. Vishamu Tanu Nar Ivri. When the butler tells the guy, he says, there's a Jewish kid in prison, right? In other words, he had a Jewish perspective. What's a Jewish perspective? That God runs the world. You see, the advisors of Pharaoh, the interpreters, they said to themselves, look, there's no way you could have 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine, because Egypt had the Nile River, which irrigated all the fields. So there was natural water supply. They didn't rely on the rain. So why would all of a sudden be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine? How does that work? It makes no sense. Because nature, there's no way to explain naturally how there could be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. It's only Joseph who thought like a Jew, that God is in charge, understood that God could withhold, despite all the natural resources and conditions for growing food. It can stop if God chooses that. And that's really the message of the Maccabees. The word Maccabee is like a hammer, but it's 4 letters. Mi kamocha be'elam Hashem. Who is like you, Almighty God? In other words, the rally cry, the battle cry, the slogan, the march of victory of the Maccabees were these 4 words. Mi kamocha be'elam. Who is like you, Almighty God? In other words, they fought with a realization and a faith in God, that God was going to help them win. Because God, who is as mighty as you? Nobody. So you could defeat our enemies. Because if the Maccabees only looked at it from a natural, physical analysis, they would have said, we're wasting our time. There's no way we could defeat these Maccabee army. I mean, the Greek armies. They're much larger and more powerful. So they would have never even attempted to fight a war that was certain to fail, because there's no way physically, according to the laws of military, strength and natural laws, to win this war. They wouldn't even set out on such a battle to win. The only reason they did is because they said, Maccabee, who's like you, Almighty God? So therefore, they put their trust in God. So the Joseph story and the Maccabee story is the same story, the story of a Jew's faith and trust in Hashem and recognition that God is the ultimate determinator in terms of what will be the outcome of any set of circumstances. It's not our physical strength or abilities, like David destroying Goliath, or like the Israeli army beating all their enemies, 1948. There's a higher power, a higher source. I want to go back to Joseph for a minute while we're on this story, and that is, why was he so impressed with his interpretation? And that is because right after he interprets the dream, there's going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. Joseph takes it a step further. He starts giving Pharaoh advice. He says, therefore, Pharaoh, this is what you got to do. You got to start storing food. You have to hoard food. You have to, stockpile food. So when the years of famine come, you'll have food to survive the 7 years of famine. Now, who was Joseph to tell Pharaoh what to do? I mean, Pharaoh only asked for an interpretation of the dream. Once you interpret the dream, your job is done. Why is he giving him advice? Pharaoh can then take that data, that information to his cabinet, his advisors, and say, okay, what are we going to do about it? Who is Joseph, this lowly prisoner, to start advising Pharaoh? And the answer is that Joseph saw that as part of the dream. You see, when God presents a problem, he also presents a solution. Whoever has the problem has the solution as well. The person who holds the problem holds the solution. So God said, I'm not just giving you a problem. I'm also giving you the answer to the problem, the solution. And in the dream, there was a solution. Where in the dream do we find the solution? So the Lubavitcher Rebbe points out very cleverly that there's one little detail in the dream that provided the whole solution. You see, it doesn't say that 7 cows came out that were fat and robust, and then 7 skinny cows followed after them and ate them up. That's not what it says. If you look in the exact text, it says the 7 fat cows came and stood on the Nile banks. Then 7 skinny cows came and stood. And here's the exact words. Vatamodna eitzel haparot. They stood alongside the fat cows on the bank of the Nile River. So there's 3 parts. Fat cows come up, then skinny cows come up and stand alongside the fat cows, and then the skinny cows eat up the fat cows. So that little detail in the middle, the Rebbe says, is where Joseph got the interpretation that God is providing a solution. Why? Because when you have 7 fat years followed by 7 skinny years, they're not side by side. First come the fat years, then come the skinny years. But you don't have them simultaneously. How could you have fat years and skinny years standing side by side on the banks of the Nile? How could they be occurring at the same time? So the Rebbe says the following. He says, what God was saying to Pharaoh was that if you start hoarding, saving, stockpiling gathering food during the plenty years for the future famine years, then you're already feeling and experiencing the famine years in the plentiful years, because you're already restricting your consumption because you're saving for the famine years. So you're already feeling the skinny cows during the fat years. And then during the skinny years, the hunger years, the famine years, you're eating off the supplies that you gather during the fat years. So during the skinny years, you're feeling the fat cows as well. And that's why they were both occurring simultaneously, because during the good years, you were already feeling the pinch of the skinny years. And during the skinny years, you're feeling the food of the good years. And therefore, they were standing side by side, because the interpretation or the solution to the famine problem that was coming was embedded in that image of the two sets of cows. And Joseph picked up on that. And therefore, Joseph says, God is not just telling you a dream to scare you. He's not giving you a nightmare for no reason. He's giving it because he wants you to know, to prepare for these 7 years of famine. And therefore, in the dream was God's solution. And therefore, that was part of the interpretation that Joseph was asked to provide to the king. And therefore, it wasn't his advice, it was Hashem's advice. And therefore, when Pharaoh heard this, he was like, wow, there's no one as smart as you. There's no one as wise as you. Because even if another interpreter said, oh, it's going to be 7 good years and 7 bad years, what am I supposed to do about that? We're going to die, 7 years of famine. How's our nation going to survive? Joseph provided the answer. And, I remember once there was someone in our shul, he said to me, he had a company once, and he said, I always told my employees, don't come to me with a problem unless you bring me a solution as well. Okay? Anyone could bring problems. That's easy to tell people all the problems. Come with a solution to the problem. That's what I need to hear, right? So Pharaoh was so delighted, not just with the interpretation, but Joseph seeing the solution to the problem in the dream. So that's one obvious connection between Hanukkah and the holiday Parshat Miketz and the holiday of Hanukkah. The other thing I'm going to show you is the other fun fact, is really a fun fact, but it's just something very interesting and cute. So you may or may not know this, but if you don't know this, you may find this interesting. Always they say you got to read the fine print, okay? Well, every Torah portion has the text of the Torah portion, but every single Torah portion in the fine print, and you could see this in your Art Scroll Chumash or in any other Chumash for that matter, although I see they don't usually bother even translating it because it's such a fine print that they don't think it's that significant. But in the fine print, after every Torah portion, oh, it does. Yeah, believe it or not. They actually, one second. Yeah, okay. At the end of every parsha, the last commentary is all about this. So basically, every Torah portion at the end tells you how many verses were in that week's Torah portion. Bar mitzvah boys like to look up, oh, how many verses are my Torah? There was a small one or a big one. Like the smallest Torah portion is Vayelech, it has 30 verses. The biggest one is Naso, has 176 verses, right? So it could be a big range. So every Torah portion has a little print at the end that says how many verses are in that week's Torah portion. So for example, Miketz, Kuf Mem Vav, which numerical value equals, every letter in Hebrew has a numerical value, a number associated with it as well. 1 through 10, 10 to 100, 100 to 400. So it's Kuf Mem Vav, 146 verses. Okay. But then it goes a step further after every Torah portion. It gives you a mnemonic, a word, or sometimes 2 words that equal that number. So if you want to remember how many verses on that week's Torah portion, you only have to remember 1 word. So for example, it gives you 3 different examples of words you could choose to remember. Either Yecheskeyo, Amitzeya, or Hashem li Aved. If you remember this, you remember how many verses are in that week's Torah portion, because those letters equal that amount. Now, I want to point out that usually these words have a connection to the Torah portion. So they're not just a random mnemonic, but they're connected. So that's in every Torah portion. How many verses and a word or 2 words, 3 words that equal the number of verses. So if you remember those words and connect it to the Torah portion, you'll know how many verses there are. So when Rabbi Label wants to lane the Torah portion, he knows, oh, this is a big portion, a little one, whatever's going on. But in this week's Torah portion, which always falls out on Hanukkah, something occurs that doesn't occur in any other Torah portion. And that is, in addition to telling you how many verses there are and what the mnemonic is, the Torah tells us, or the one who wrote this is not from God, it's the one who set the Torah book and the printing press, added this at the end. He tells us how many words are in this week's Torah portion. No other Torah portion that tells us how many words, only this week's Torah portion. And how many words are there? 2,025 words. That's how many words are in the 146 verses and 2,025 words. And the question is, why? From all the Torah portions, is this the only one, the one that falls on a Hanukkah, that we're told that it's 2,025 words? So when you think about 2,025, the easier one to know is the number 25. We all know that Hanukkah occurred on the 25th day of the month. Since it happened on the 25th day of the month, Chanukah, as they rested on the 25th day. So that explains the number 25, perhaps. But what's the significance of 2,000? So we all know we light 8 candles on Hanukkah, right? Now, the word for candle in Hebrew is ner. Ner is made up of 2 letters, a nun and a resh. Nun equals 50 and a resh equals 200. In other words, the word for candle in Hebrew equals 250. 8 candles is 8 times 250 is 2,000. The miracle occurred on the 25th day is 2,025. So that's perhaps the reason why it lists how many words, 2,025 for the 8 candles and the 25th day of the month, which is when the miracle occurred. Back to our Torah portion of Miketz. Why did God show Pharaoh the dream twice? To let him know that it's going to happen soon. It was something that was going to transpire immediately. That was the reason for the repetition of the dream. But what's interesting is, in the simple reading, Paro has a dream, and what does he do? He goes back to sleep. And then he has a second dream. And maybe God had to give him a second dream because he went back to sleep. He didn't take it seriously. Now, if you remember, Jacob went to sleep one night. He saw a ladder going from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. And he woke up. He said, God's in this place. He made a monument. He made an altar. He thanked God. He made a vow. But Pharaoh just goes back to sleep. And our rabbis sometimes point this out to say, what happens when we have a dream in life, when we have a vision, a prophecy, or an idea, right? Don't go back to sleep. Act on your dreams. The Panovich Rav, who came from Europe, his community was decimated, and he said, I'm going to rebuild in Bnei Brak a yeshiva just like I had back in Panovich. And they said, you're dreaming. He says, I know I am, but I dream with my eyes wide open. You have to dream with your eyes open. You have to act on your dreams. You can't go back to sleep the way Pharaoh went back to sleep. You have to get up and realize you've been given a dream, you've been given a vision, a prophecy, and you have to act on that immediately. So that is the difference between Pharaoh and Jacob and their dreams. Let's move on a little bit into the story, because what's going to happen in this week's Torah portion is really super exciting, a very, very dramatic Torah portion, because the years of famine are going to set in. And the famine is felt, of course, not only in Egypt, but also in the land of Israel, where Jacob and the remainder of his family are living. who are still grieving. Jacob, the father, is still grieving for the loss of his son Joseph, who he's told a wild animal devoured. And as the famine sets in, Jacob says to his kids, I need you to go and buy food in Egypt. But before I get to the brothers coming to Egypt to buy food, I left out a big detail. And that is Joseph gets married in Egypt. Not only does he become vice of Egypt, he gets married. And you're not going to believe who he marries. He marries the daughter of his former master that he was a slave by. He was a slave by Potiphar. Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him. And now, who does he marry? The daughter of Potiphar, which means his mother-in-law was the woman who tried to seduce him. Now that sounds really weird, right? Why in the world would he marry this girl from his former master? So I'm going to give you two interpretations. One is the measure says that, and this is like really connecting stories, but if you remember the story when Dinah was abducted and raped, remember that story a couple of weeks ago? Actually, last week's Torah portion, right? No, actually 2 weeks ago. So what happened? The brothers wiped out the whole city. Shimon and Levi, they took back their sister, Dinah. But our rabbis tell us that Dinah got pregnant with Hamor, the ruler's son from Shechem. And this daughter that was born to Dinah was adopted, given up for adoption. And who was the child of a rape? Who adopted her? Potiphar's wife. But really, this baby was the daughter of Dinah, the granddaughter of Jacob. So now Joseph marries the daughter of Potiphar, which is really the adopted baby of Dinah, which means that it was really his his niece he was marrying. Now, it wasn't through the same mother because Joseph's mother was Rachel and Dinah's mother was Leah. But once again, she was part of the descendants of Jacob's family. Now, that's one answer. But another answer that's given that's quite interesting is that, when they wanted to appoint Joseph viceroy of Egypt, there was one problem. What was the problem? He had a criminal record. He was an ex-felon. He was accused of, trying to rape or seduce the wife of his master. So how do you take a guy who's an inmate, a convict, and appoint him prime minister of the country? So therefore, they had to refute and expose the lie that she claimed that Joseph attacked her. And they had to show that he was really innocent all along. How did they do that? By having them take Joseph as a son-in-law. The very woman and her husband who accused them of this attack, now they gave their daughter to him to marry. That proved to everybody that he was an innocent man. Because if he was really guilty, they wouldn't allow their daughter to be married to him. And now that he was prime minister, they happily gave their daughter to him as a wife. But he marries Asnat bat Potiphera. And he goes on to have 2 children. And these 2 children that Joseph has in Egypt are very, very famous because they get mentioned at every Shabbat dinner, every Friday night in Jewish homes around the globe. Because after we sing the Shalom Aleichem to welcome the angels, and then we sing the Eshel Chayil for the woman of valor, we bless our children. And what do we bless our children? We bless our daughters to be like Sarah, Becca, Rachel, and Leah. And then we give them the priestly blessing. And then we bless our sons. Now, you would have thought we would bless our sons to be the equivalent of Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, who are the matriarchs. Bless the boys to be like the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But what do? We don't bless them to be like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We bless them to be like Ephraim and Menashe, the two sons of Joseph. May God make you like Ephraim and Menashe. And of course, the old question is why? What's wrong with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Why do we bless them to be like Ephraim and Menashe, who are the grandchildren of Jacob, not the patriarchs, not Jacob's 12 tribes, but the 12 tribes' grandchildren? And one very, very famous and beautiful answer is that these are the first two brothers that got along with each other. You see, all the girls got along. Sarah had no problem. Rebecca, Rachel, no problem. But the men were always fighting. There were never siblings that got along with each other, because Abraham's two kids were Isaac, but Ishmael, they didn't get along. Jacob had a brother Esau who didn't get along. The 12 tribes, they fought with Joseph. The first generation of brothers who love each other in the Torah and don't fight, on the contrary, they're going to get along with each other and love each other unconditionally. We're going to see later how that happens. When Jacob puts his right hand on the younger son, Ephraim, he says, that's fine. He's okay with it. There's no jealousy. There's no sibling rivalry. It was Ephraim and Menashe. And so when we bless our children, if we have more than one child, our greatest blessing is that the children should get along with each other. There should never be any separation or conflict between them. So that's why we choose Ephraim and Menashe. So it's very important to understand. Another famous reason given is that the other children were all raised in Israel, in the Holy Land, in holy families. Ephraim and Menashe were the first children to be born in exile out in Egypt, in a foreign land, in a culture that was foreign to Judaism. But yet they were raised as proper Jewish children even there. And therefore, our blessing is that wherever life takes our children, even if they end up in a foreign land like Egypt, they should still remain true to their Jewish identity, to their values, to their traditions. They shouldn't lose their way spiritually, just like Ephraim and Menashe managed to remain true to their Jewish identity. So that is just an important story to know. These two famous brothers, Ephraim and Menashe, were born right here in this week's Torah portion. Let's go back now to the main story, which is the brothers coming to Egypt to procure food for the family. So what happens? The brothers come down to Egypt, and here's the very famous verse. Vayaker Yosef et achav. Yosef recognized, he identified, he spotted his brothers. Vehem lo hikiru. They did not recognize him. He sees, my gosh, these are my brothers that came to buy food. But they don't realize that the man behind the royal viceroy garb is actually their baby brother who they sold into slavery. Now, there are two reasons for that. One is obviously he was dressed not like a Jewish boy from Israel, which is the way they saw him last. In the Jewish garb, he was now wearing the Egyptian wardrobe of the viceroy, which obviously was very magnificent and threw them off. But also, he was the baby brother. He was a teenager. He was 17 when he was sold into slavery. And now, this is a story of, he spent 12 years in prison. Then there was a 7 years. So now it's 20 years later. Joseph is now 37 years old. So it's no wonder when you're a teenager, you look very different than you look when you're 37. He still was like a baby face with no facial hair or anything like that. So they didn't recognize that this was Joseph. So that is where the plot begins. He sees them and recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. Okay? So this is where the story all gets very interesting, because Yosef decides to he starts to play a little game with them. And I don't mean a game because he's not playing games. Why was he doing this? We're gonna have to understand why he was doing this. But it looks like he's playing a game with them. What does he do? He accuses them of being spies. Now, where did he come up with such a crazy idea? Because the brothers knew they sold their brother Joseph into Egypt. And they were saying, maybe we could find him. They regretted what they did. So they said, let's all go into the country through different gates. Maybe we'll spot him, we'll recognize him, we'll see him somewhere. Instead of all going through one gate, we'll go through different entrance points of the city. And Joseph said, if all you came here was to buy food, why'd you come through different gates of the city? I think you're spies and you're spying on this country. So the brothers tell him, no, that's not the reason why we came in through different gates. We came in through different gates because we had a younger brother who we lost. And we are looking, we have a father in Israel. We lost one brother. And we have one baby brother back at home. And we were looking for this brother, so we came in through different gates. So the viceroy of Egypt, Joseph, knowing it's the brothers, say, well, I don't believe you. I think you're lying. Prove to me that you have a baby brother. Go back to Israel and bring your baby brother here. And until then, I'm going to hold Shimon, one of the brothers, who's one of the strong brothers. He said, I'm going to take him as ransom, as a hostage, as collateral. That if you don't prove that you're telling me the truth by coming back with your baby brother, you will not ever see Shimon again. And don't ever come back to Egypt for food without your brother. And he sends them off with food, but not with their brother Shimon. Now imagine the brothers, right? Here, they already sold Joseph years ago. Now, they come to buy food, and this viceroy is a lunatic. He's a madman. He starts accusing them of being spies. And then what happens? He says, prove to me you have a baby brother. And until you prove that, I'm not letting your brother Shimon go home. And now they come back to their father and they tell him the story. And the father is furious with them. He says, why did you have to tell them you have a brother? Why did you open your mouth? There's no way I'm not letting Benjamin go to Egypt because I only have 2 sons from my wife, Rachel. I already lost Joseph. I'm not risking losing Benjamin in Egypt. So he says, no, you're not going back. And only when the food really runs out, and just give you the end of the story here, he has no choice because there's no food. They're going to starve. And at that point, Judah says, let me take responsibility. I promise you, Dad, you give him over to my hands. I will make sure that he comes home alive. So Jacob has no choice. He says, okay, the man, he should show you compassion and return him in peace. And the story gets wilder and wilder, and it reaches a climax at the end of this week's Torah portion. But basically what happens is they go to Egypt. The man says, okay, you prove that you're telling me the truth. Here is Shimon back from prison. Here's the food. Here's Benjamin. You're on your way. But even before he does that, he invites them to the palace for a lavish meal. He hosts them in his palace for a lavish meal. And he seats them according to the order of the age, which for the life of them, they can't figure out how this viceroy knew their ages. So everything was shrouded in mystery and in confusion. They couldn't figure any of that out. But then he sends them on their way. And you would think everything is great. They're going home. They're in good shape. They got the whole family intact, meaning they got Shimon and Benjamin. They got the food. They're going home. But this is the way the Torah portion ends. As they're leaving the city gates, the Egyptian forces pursue them. And the Egyptian forces arrest them and say, someone stole the royal goblet from the viceroy's table when you were invited for dinner. And they're like, none of us would do something like that. It's not us. They said, well, we have to search the bags. So they all get off their camels. They start searching the bags. They start with the oldest brother, which was Reuben. They make their way down. And then when they come to the youngest brother, Benjamin, what do they find in his backpack? The goblet of Joseph. And they say, you are being taken back to Egypt now as prisoners for stealing the royal goblet. And they're all dragged back to Egypt to stand in front of the viceroy, being accused of stealing the royal goblet. And they caught him red-handed. It was in his backpack. And of course, we know Joseph planted it in the backpack. And now, exasperating their turmoil, their confusion, their distress. Here they thought they finally got out of Egypt with the food and the family. And now this crazy accusation. And the viceroy says, the one who stole it shall remain a permanent slave to me. You guys go home, he's staying behind, which is exactly what Jacob was afraid, that he would lose his other son. And now Judah was the one who said he's going to take responsibility. And what's he going to do now? And next week is where we're going to read about what Judah does. And that's where the reunion with Joseph is going to say, I am Joseph, as my father is still alive. But to go back to the big question, what is this game that Joseph is playing with them? And why is he playing it with them? And the answer couldn't be more beautiful. And the answer is that Joseph wanted to forgive the brothers, but not until they do teshuvah, not until they demonstrate that they change their ways. And so what does he do? He puts them to the test. He sets up a set of circumstances where Benjamin is accused. First of all, Benjamin is brought down to Egypt, his half-brother, his brother, I should say, his only brother. And he then sets up a set of circumstances where the younger brother of Rachel, the only other child of the woman Rachel, who they had this conflict with, Rachel's children, is accused of a crime and going to be held as a prisoner in Egypt. And he wants to see, what does he do? What do they do? Do they allow their brother to be taken prisoner and abandon him, forsake him, like they did to Joseph all those years ago when they threw him in the pit and sold him into slavery? Now Benjamin is being taken into slavery. Are they going to allow their baby brother to be taken into slavery? Or are they going to do something to defend him, to protect him, to stand up for him? And of course, the brothers are going to pass the test, because sure enough, Yehuda is going to stand up and say, no, next week, don't take him, take me instead. And that's when Joseph breaks down crying, because he realizes that it took many, many years, but the brothers ultimately learned the lesson, not to betray a brother, not to abandon a brother, to risk your life for your brother. And this is the remarkable ending to the story. And then ultimately Jacob is going to come to Egypt and the whole family is going to be reunited. And this becomes one of the most famous stories, Joseph in the coat of many colors, and the most powerful example of forgiveness, perhaps in the entire Torah. When your own family members betrayed you, not only betrayed you, but tried to kill you. And you suffered so much because of that. You were in prison and you were enslaved. But yet, to be able to let go and say, God sent me here. There was a reason, there was a purpose. I had to save the land from famine. And I hold no animosity or grudge towards you. So this is quite a remarkable story. And we'll look forward to reading it with all of its details this coming Shabbat. So thank you all for joining. And I look forward to being in touch with all of you. Take care and a happy Hanukkah again. Thank you. Bye.